Binding vows are a big part of Jujutsu Kaisen and something fans have seen multiple times throughout the story. They work like contracts, and a sorcerer can make one with themselves or with someone else. These contracts aren't just for show, they serve a purpose. A binding vow can be used to reach a certain goal or even boost a sorcerer's power by adding specific conditions. In battle, these vows can be game changers, but there's a catch. Breaking them comes with serious consequences. The story hasn't fully explored what happens when a binding vow is broken, but it's clear that it's not something a sorcerer would want to risk. Over the years, Jujutsu Kaisen has introduced many different binding vows, with some playing a much bigger role in the story than others. Anyway, before we begin, please press the like button and please subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any daily uploads. What is a binding vow? A binding vow is basically a contract made using cursed energy. Anyone who knows how to manipulate cursed energy, whether they're human or a cursed spirit, can create one. And it's not just between two people. A sorcerer can also make a binding vow with themselves. Unlike complex techniques, a binding vow doesn't require an incantation or any special cursed energy manipulation. It's more like a verbal agreement, a promise that cannot be broken. As soon as both sides agree on the terms, the contract is sealed. That's why even the most dangerous sorcerers like Sukuna or Pseudo Suguru are careful with these vows. Once a binding vow is made, it must be followed. The length and complexity of the contract depend on the agreement itself. But there's one rule: it cannot be changed or canceled. Trying to break it leads to severe consequences. The story hasn't revealed exactly what happens yet. What's clear is that even the smartest manipulators in Jujutsu Kaisen won't risk going against one. A binding vow with oneself is like making a serious promise to yourself, but with real consequences. If a vow between two people is an unbreakable agreement, then this is a self-imposed rule designed to gain more power at a cost. The most common way sorcerers do this is by placing restrictions on themselves or their techniques in exchange for a boost in strength. The stricter the limitation, the greater the reward. For example, if a sorcerer vows to only use a technique under certain conditions, they might get a huge power increase when they finally activate it. Breaking a self-binding vow isn't as severe as breaking one with another person. Instead of facing unknown consequences, the user simply loses the power boost they gained. For example, if a vow gave them 10% more cursed energy output, breaking it would take away that advantage. A common form of this vow is revealing details about a technique to an opponent. By explaining how it works, a sorcerer's cursed energy output increases. This is seen with Todo, Nanami, and even Gojo to some extent. A stronger example is Nanami's overtime vow. During normal work hours, he limits his cursed energy to 80–90%. But once he enters overtime, his output jumps to 110 to 120%, making him much stronger. Binding vow between two people is more than just a promise. It's an unbreakable contract where both sides must follow the agreement. These vows aren't limited to humans either. Even cursed spirits can enter them, as long as both parties agree to the terms. For a vow to work, there must be mutual interest. Both sides gain something, and neither can take unfair advantage. Even if the deal looks one-sided to others, as long as both agree, the vow is sealed. Unlike a self-binding vow, breaking one with another person has serious consequences. The punishment isn't always clear. It could be bodily harm, loss of cursed energy, or something worse. This is why even Sukuna respects these vows. One major example is the binding vow between Mahito and Mechamaru. Mahito agreed to heal Mechamaru's body using idol transfiguration in exchange for information about Jujutsu High. Another critical vow is Sukuna's deal with Yuji Itadori. In exchange for reviving Yuji, Sukuna can take over his body for 1 minute whenever he says, "Enchain." Compared to flashy techniques like domain expansion or reversed curse technique, binding vows seem simple, but in reality, they're one of the most versatile abilities a sorcerer can have. Now let's start ranking and explain everything about binding vows. 7. Revealing one's hand. This is a self-imposed binding vow where a sorcerer openly explains their technique to their opponent. In return, their technique becomes stronger. It's a risky move because giving away that kind of information could backfire. But smart sorcerers don't just blurt out everything. They use carefully chosen words to trick their opponent. Not exactly lying, but not giving the full truth either. This way they get the power boost without making themselves completely vulnerable. 6. Overtime. Nanami's overtime is one of the best examples of a binding vow. While on duty for Jujutsu High, he limits his cursed energy to 80 to 90%. But if his work extends past his usual hours, the restriction is lifted and his power jumps to 110 to 120%. This gives him a huge advantage in battle. That extra power lets him compete with special grade sorcerers, making it one of the smartest and most practical binding vows. 5. Yuji and Sukuna's binding vow. This was one of the first binding vows introduced in JJK, and it played a huge role in shaping the story. When Yuji was on the verge of death, Sukuna offered him a deal. He would heal him, but in return, he could take control of Yuji's body for 1 minute whenever he said the word enchained. To make the deal seem safe, Sukuna promised not to kill anyone during that minute, but there was a catch. Yuji would forget that the vow even existed. At first, Yuji refused, but in the end, he had no choice but to accept, unknowingly making one of the most dangerous deals in the entire series. 4. Kokichi, Muta, and Mahito's vow. Muta made a secret binding vow with Mahito because Mahito and Goto needed a spy inside Jujutsu High. In exchange for leaking information, Mahito promised to heal Muta's broken body using soul manipulation. Muta fulfilled his end of the deal, giving them everything they wanted. Mahito kept his word, restoring Muta's body, but right after that he turned against him and attacked. Muto thought this broke the contract since the attack on Jujutsu High had already begun, but Mahito denied it, claiming he never personally harmed any students. Hanami did. It's still unclear if this vow was actually broken or if Mahito found a loophole to avoid any consequences. Wee Wee and Mei Mei's binding vow. Wee Wee has a strange binding vow with his sister Mei Mei. His cursed energy is restricted until Mei Mei gives him permission to use it. The exact benefit of this isn't fully explained, but it's likely that once the restriction is lifted, his power increases. What makes this binding vow unusual is that he willingly puts himself under his sister's control purely because he wants to please her. Next up is Kinney's and the Sorcerer's Vow. This is one of the most important binding vows in JJK, and it all traces back to 1,000 years ago. Kenjaku had a contract with sorcerers from the past, sealing their remains inside cursed objects. This vow stayed intact until Kenjaku took over Suguru's body, which caused the contract to break. After absorbing Mahito, Kenjaku used idol transfiguration to forcefully give people cursed techniques and then unsealed the cursed objects, bringing back ancient sorcerers who had originally made pacts with him. This binding vow changed everything, setting the stage for the culling game and the chaos that followed. 1. Yuta, Okatsu, and the Higher-Up's Vow. After the Shibuya incident, Yuta was assigned to execute Yuji. To make it official, he entered a binding vow, swearing that he would kill him. But behind the scenes, Yuta was actually following Gojo's orders. If anything happened to Gojo, Yuta was supposed to protect Yuji, so when the time came, Yuta stabbed Yuji in the chest, making it seem like he had completed the vow. However, Yuta is a master of reverse curse technique, so he healed Yuji right after, technically fulfilling his promise to both the higher-ups and Gojo. So what happens if someone breaks a binding vow? Does it depend on the type of vow? What if both sides go against the agreement? And what if someone breaks a vow they made to themselves? Breaking a binding vow with oneself? First off, breaking any binding vow has consequences, but when it's a self-imposed vow, the punishment is much more forgiving. A binding vow with oneself is meant to boost cursed techniques. If someone breaks their own vow, they don't get hit with some brutal punishment, they just lose the power boost they would have gained. Take Nanami's overtime vow as an example. If he decides not to hold back his cursed energy during work hours, he simply won't get the extra power boost when he goes into overtime. It's a give-and-take system, but nothing too extreme. Kenjaku himself explained that a self-imposed vow is nowhere near as dangerous as a vow made with another person. Oh man, looks like I completely forgot to rank Sukuna's binding vow, and this guy has 6 of them. Oh, here we go. Sukuna 6, binding vows from the Shinjuku Showdown arc. And honestly, this guy was out here making deals like his life depended on it, which, to be fair, it did. First off, Sukuna used a binding vow to enhance his output by shrinking the range of his domain. Let's just call it what it is. He was too scared of Gojo. Gojo was about to wipe the floor with him using unlimited void, so Sukuna had no choice but to shrink his domain to try to pack more punch. He cut down the area of his malevolent shrine to focus more power into a smaller space, hoping it'd actually do something. But here's the thing, Sukuna wasn't playing 5D chess here. He was literally cornered. Gojo wasn't even trying that hard, and Sukuna was out here barely holding on. This strategy was just him throwing everything at the wall and hoping something would stick. Next up, Sukuna gets even more desperate by restricting his domain range even further, hoping this extreme compression will give him the strength he desperately needed. Like, dude, how much power do you need? This isn't mastery of technique, this is just a panic button. He sacrifices even more area just to get a little more power, but guess what? It still didn't cut through Gojo's defenses. Gojo was still outclassing him the whole time. Sukuna couldn't even catch a break. Bruh, how many times do you have to tweak your own technique before admitting you're just not good enough? This was trial and error at its finest. Sukuna wasn't strategizing, he was troubleshooting. Meanwhile, Gojo was over here adapting mid-fight with zero setbacks, making Sukuna look like a frustrated player in a fighting game who keeps adjusting the settings because they can't win. Then we got the instant dismantle nonsense. So let me get this straight. He needed a whole binding vow just to use one of his most basic techniques instantly? Like, bro, what? Gojo was out here speed blitzing reality itself and you need a contract just to throw out a faster attack? This is pathetic. Imagine needing to sign a contract just to use your own technique correctly. You think Gojo needed a binding vow to throw hollow purple? Nah, cause he's actually him. Now, let's talk about the dumbest moment in the whole fight. This space-cutting garbage. Sukuna saw Mahoraga do all the work, figured, oh hey, let me just copy that, and suddenly he could cut through infinity? Bro, no, first of all, infinity is infinite. You cannot cut what doesn't have an endpoint. That's literally the entire concept. But suddenly, oh, well, if I just attack space itself, then I win. That is the laziest, most forced plot nonsense ever. And let's be honest, he wouldn't have even figured this out if Mahoraga hadn't done it first. Sukuna had zero clue what to do before that. He saw Gojo running circles around him and thought, damn, I need an out. And the worst part, even after all of this cheap trickery, plot conveniences, and borrowed moves, Gojo still had him beat. That's the part Sukuna fans will never admit. This dude had every advantage handed to him. 10 shadows, Mahoraga adapting for him, multiple binding vows, broken domain mechanics, a literal ass pull technique, and he still needed the story to hold his hand just to get the win? Gojo dominated this fight from start to finish. The dude was manhandling Sukuna like it was just another day at work. If anything, Sukuna should have been thanking the writer for keeping him in the fight. At the end of the day, this wasn't a real win, this wasn't skill, this wasn't strategy. This was a glorified participation trophy handed to Sukuna because the plot demanded it. He will never be the strongest sorcerer. He will go down in history as the biggest fraud in Jujutsu Kaisen, and everyone knows it. Okay, let me stop bashing Sukuna and explain this binding vow. When he originally learned it, Sukuna could launch a slash that cuts the world by only having to form the hand sign of Enma, the same two-handed sign needed to cast Malevolent Shrine. However, Sukuna was unable to fulfill this condition after losing a hand to Gojo's hollow purple. In order to bypass the conditions and launch the enhanced dismantle, Sukuna imposed a binding vow on himself that required him to make the hand sign, chant Dismantle's incantation, and direct the slash's trajectory with his palm for all subsequent uses. Now we're moving on to the next one, where Sukuna limits his Malevolent Shrine to 99 seconds. He had to change the hand sign, apply cursed and barrier techniques with only part of his brain because infinity was messing with him, and include some improvised vows to make it work. All of this was so he could maintain 100% output for those 99 seconds. He was basically squeezing the most out of those few seconds, using whatever means necessary to make sure nothing slipped through. Next up, this man tries to make his furnace technique stronger. You'd think after binding out other different binding vows, this guy would have figured out how to use his powers without all the extra work. Nope. Instead, he has to limit his technique to one target in his domain and make a vow to mitigate Divine Flame's slow speed and narrow range. Sukuna entered into a binding vow that restricted him from using Divine Flame when outnumbered unless inside his domain. In return, Malevolent Shrine's curse technique is expanded, imbuing all the pulverized substances within it with the same explosive cursed energy as Divine Flame, which he contains within the domain by altering the barrier specifications to restrict entry and exit for everything other than living creatures. This effectively turns the particles into thermobaric explosives that scatter throughout the domain, which are detonated when Divine Flame is unleashed, causing instantaneous, high-temperature shockwaves, decompression, and intense pressurization that kills all living things within the domain. Why? Because he's that weak. Even his own techniques can't function without a vow to hold them up. It's like he needed an assist just to do his job. No wonder he's called a king. He needs a whole team just to win. And finally, Sukuna tries to extend his domain's duration, which, honestly, is one of the most ridiculous moves he's done. To do this, he had to perform a binding vow, reducing the range of his domain to be the size of Yuta's domain. The logic? Basically, if you reduce the range, it's easier to maintain the domain longer. So instead of keeping it full size and draining his energy, he shrunk it down and could extend it for much longer than the usual 99 seconds, getting it to about 3 minutes. This was Sukuna's attempt at a strategic trade-off. Take a lighter load to keep his power up for a longer time. It was like he was gambling that by making his domain smaller, he could run it longer, but still, he needed to bind himself to a whole limit just to do it. So yeah, just more evidence that Sukuna's whole existence seems to rely on making vows to keep his powers in check and trying to force things to work in his favor. Instead of simply being naturally powerful, he's just overcomplicating everything with his constant need for bound vows. All that effort and he still couldn't outclass Gojo without the plot intervening? Anyway, please press the like button and please subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any daily uploads.